the point was this: you are sometimes taken to task for being overly focused on personal responsibility and neglecting the collective well-being functioning of society level. Now, as luck would have it, that was actually on my list of things to talk to you about today, because here's what I have learned as a lifelong liberal who has now gotten to an age where wisdom is beginning to dawn, is there is something about the personal responsibility argument that is absolutely essential. And there is a reason that it looms so large in the minds of so many high-quality thinkers, in spite of what it doesn't do. The reason is, if you're going to advise somebody or some small group of people on how to approach life, it's the slam dunk winner, right? It actually works. You do have power over yourself and how you interact with the world. So if you encounter a system that's very unfair, you can complain about the unfairness, and you have a very low chance of affecting it at all. Or you can say, well, it may be unfair, but I'm going to play the cards I've been dealt as well as I can. And that's something over which you have a tremendous amount of control. So I think there's a way in which just in terms of return on investment, there's almost no return on the investment in complaining about a broken system. There's tremendous returns to be had.
Well, it's especially true if you're not already competent and
Right.
seen to be competent. Maybe you have some ghost of a chance of changing things if you are competent and are seen to be competent. But before then, you can break things, but building them, that's pretty damn hard.
Absolutely.
And you can work locally, and then you have some chance of success. And you can find out what is under your control. And then maybe you can turn yourself into someone who can make cautious systemic adjustments and have them be for the good rather than for harm.
Whereas if you take the other approach and you say, well, the system isn't fair, and I'm going to change the system, but you don't invest in your own competence, then A, you're unlikely to fix the system. But even if you do, you still don't arrive in it competent. And so you're still going to be outcompeted by people who did invest in personal responsibility. So in some sense, it's just a loser of a position from the point of view of an individual's allocation of their time and effort. On the other hand, let's say, I first started thinking about this when I encountered a number of Black conservatives who initially I didn't understand why there were Black conservatives, because it seemed like the system is unfair to Blacks. I know this to be true. And so putting the responsibility on the individual didn't make sense to me. But then I realized what I've just said to you, that from the point of view of helping people, this is the winner, as the argument goes, and the other one doesn't even work. But here's the problem with it. Let's say that you get the attention of a number of people who are deciding between whether to complain about the unfairness of the system or invest in personal responsibility, and you convince them that personal responsibility is the best answer. Okay? They will do better. They will do better at somebody else's expense. They will outcompete someone else. And it may be that you haven't increased the amount of wealth in their quadrant of the system at all. And so while you've given them good advice for not ending up at the short end of the stick, you didn't solve a problem. It just shifted where it went. So there is
I think that would be more dangerous if personal responsibility was directly associated with like socioeconomic success as an infallible marker of that responsibility. It's partly why I try to concentrate more on ethical behavior and grounding responsibility in that, because I think that I don't think that you have to gain at the expense of other people if you play the game properly. I think you can gain. It's hard, and it's hard to do this, but you can play the game so that the people around you benefit at the same time you do, and that's actually a better game anyways, even for you. And I know that can run into zero-sum problems, but no matter what you do, it can run into zero-sum problems. I think it has the best chance of minimizing those zero-sum problems over the long run. So you play the game and you don't cheat. So if you're going to be a plumber, then you're a good plumber. And that's good because no one wants their basement full of sewage. It doesn't hurt anyone. You outcompete some of the plumbers who aren't doing so well.
So I agree with you completely. You can generate some wealth by increasing your capacity, which means it's not zero sum. You ultimately may run into a zero sum game in which the fact is somebody's going to be the loser.
Part of the reason that I wrote the second book, Beyond Order, was to state something like, look, try to be successful, try to be responsible. But if you find out that you're being successful in a zero-sum game and your success is at the expense of someone else, then you change the system.
Perfect.
That's why it's beyond order. It's like, because your point is something like, well, if the game is unfair and you're good at it, then you just get better at exploitation. It's like, right. Of course, systems can be corrupt. And then if you're a good player in that game, then you're the best at being corrupt. But that's the situation where you have an ethical obligation to move beyond your responsibility and to adjust the game. That's how it looks to me.
Right. Oh, no, we've landed in exactly the same place. That's the point, is that the problem is that the system is effectively in breach of contract, which doesn't say anything at all about whether or not your best move is to complain about the system or invest in your personal capacity.
I would say it's also an eternal truth that the system is in breach of contract. That's an existential reality. It's always now to a greater or lesser degree, because there are systems that are completely unplayable and there are systems that are relatively playable. But the idea that your conscience should be bothered by the corruption of the system is like absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that you should go making incautious changes as a consequence of resentment.
Right. So now the present looks so insane from this perspective that you and I appear to share, right? Where we are now educating children ever younger in obsessing about defects of the system, many of them imaginary, right? Rather than giving them competence. In fact, we are demonizing the very acquisition of competence.
Perfect. That's exact. So that's something that needs to be broadcast everywhere. I think that the pathology that's at the core of the culture war is an attack on competence itself. It's an attack on competence, the idea of competence as well. That's why the critiques of meritocracy emerge, or that's at least part of the motivation for that. And everyone, you can say, well, look, do you rise according to your merit? It's like partly, okay, partly. And corruption reduces the correlation. But to say partly and to admit to the existence of some corruption is not the same thing at all as to say merit itself is a corrupt idea.
Right.
That's a completely different set of propositions with completely different outcomes.
Totally agree. And so we are constantly in this battle where if we say anything in defense of the idea of merit or meritocracy, we are understood to have claimed that we live in a meritocracy, and what's more, a perfect one. And then this is used to remove any impulse towards the acquisition of capacity. And to do this to children is so
terrible. It's terrible.
Yes, it's
the worst of all possible things you can do to children, because you punish them for their virtues.
Right. You're not giving them brain damage. You're giving them mind damage. You're damaging their minds.
Well, I looked at what happened in Boston this week so a number of the schools for the gifted my understanding is were closed down because of racial inequality in their makeup. And I thought, well, it's obviously an undesirable, it's obviously problematic. But why should I assume that the motives of those who shut down the gifted system is the remediation of racism rather than an assault on the gifted? Because it's them that suffer immediately for it.
Right.
Now, maybe that's unfair, but I can't help but think that what we are seeing in the guise of virtue is an assault on the idea, an assault on competence. The thing is, competence presupposes value, and value presupposes a hierarchy. So if you admit to competence, you admit to a value hierarchy and differential ability, and that flies in the face of equality. So
I completely agree. And the obvious answer, of course, is irrespective of how unfair the system is, you should invest in your own competence. You should make use of what tools you have. And then we collectively ought to democratize the tools as well as we can.
Yes.
Because society is clearly best, and it is the morally only acceptable thing for everyone to have.
Well, it's even the only self-interested thing.
Ultimately.
I would rather that you were more competent. Now, if you're head-to-head in a competition with me, I might let resentment, allow me to desire your destruction. But all things considered, if you're competent, well, great, then you're going to offer me something. Okay, so we could agree perhaps that there is an element of the war on competence. That's the pathological end of this culture war that we're seeing. And we should also say that there's no doubt also a fair bit of attempts to rectify the terrible consequences of power-based inequality. Right? So the good is intermingled with the bad, but we have to pay attention to the bad. Then another question would be, and I don't know the answer to this at all, if we're seeing the rise of something like a war on competence, why are we seeing it? And why now?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Let's put it this way. I do not know of any evidence that it is our global enemies seeding this, but they could hardly have done better, right? Were they to try to get us to sabotage ourselves, they could hardly have done better than to get us to demonize our own competence and to sabotage our own children. I mean, the thing that I can't get over is, all right, if we woke up and came to our senses tomorrow, how long would it take for all of the nonsense to clear the system and for us to get back to the level of competence that we were headed towards? I mean, we're talking about, the arguments have gotten particularly stupid in the last couple of years, but the overarching degradation of the system by those who didn't believe in competence in the first place goes back decades and has had a tremendous effect. And you know what? The bridges aren't falling down yet, not in large numbers, but that's by virtue of the fact that they were built by competent people and they don't require, yearly maintenance. And this is going to catch up to us. It is time for us to return to our senses and get back to business right quick, or we are going to leave ourselves vulnerable to people who care so much less about freedom and about justice than we do.